Joining us all the way from London is Professor Mukulika Banerjee, who is the inaugural director of the LSE South Asia Centre and is an associate professor in social anthropology at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She has written several books and has done research both in Pakistan and in India. Her latest project is a new monograph called Cultivating Democracy, Politics, and Citizenship in Agrarian India. Thank you so much for coming all the way from London, Professor. Our third panelist is Anand Shah, who's the founder of LiveSust and a partner at TheAsiaGroup. He holds several feathers in his cap, one of which is being the senior vice president of the Indian ride-hailing giant Ola. Anand has spent 15 years living in India and has worked extensively on solar policy, electric vehicle policy, urban development, and international affairs. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on how India is still a democracy, if at all.
Thank you.
Last but not the least is Sadanand Dhume, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he writes on South Asian political economy, foreign policy, business, and society with a focus on India and Pakistan. Sadanand has actually been a teacher to me as well, and I have learned tremendously from Sadanand's views. If today Sadanand was in India, probably he would not have had permission to come here either. But we're so glad that you could join us, Sadanand. Over to you, Professor Bose.
Thank you very much, Ananya. And let me begin by congratulating the student organizers of this conference, and especially Krishna Sahai and Ananya Chowcharia, who are in charge of our very pertinent panel on the past, present, and future of democracy in India. Having long been interested in the theory and history of democracy, I had an opportunity to engage in the practice of democracy by being a participant observer in the 16th Lok Sabha from 2014 until 2019. The election campaign of 2014 was an exhilarating experience, and I would add, a learning experience for me, and also it was wonderful to be teaching in classrooms with a difference, in the various urban neighborhoods and the villages in the Jadavpur parliamentary constituency. When I entered the Lok Sabha and gave my first speech in June of 2014, I felt that I had to issue a warning to the incoming government not to confuse uniformity with unity and majoritarianism with democracy. And in fact, I think it is majoritarianism masquerading as democracy that undergirds the turn towards authoritarianism in contemporary global politics in many countries of the world, and India is no exception. The other point that I remember making in that first speech was that as I looked around at my colleagues, I felt that the 16th Lok Sabha did not adequately represent the diversity of India. And one of the facts that I had in mind, of course, was that from the most populous state of India, Uttar Pradesh, which had sent 80 members of parliament, there was not a single Muslim representative. And of course, the Muslim population is over 80% of the population of that state.
20%.
Now 20%, surely, yeah. And so I, of course, felt that some of us who had managed to get there had to speak up forcefully for underrepresented minorities, but that is not a long-term solution. One has to have a democratic setup in India where, as we say in the United States of America, it looks like India. We keep hearing in the United States of America that we must have representative institutions that look like America in all its diversity. Those are my quick opening remarks. Of course, I spent the next few years trying to offer principled opposition to the government of the day, taking part in debates on what was euphemistically called growing intolerance in the country, the right of students to speak up and not be branded anti-nationals for doing so. And then, of course, in a major debate in 2017, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that the next 5 years will be transformational, as transformational as the 5 years from 1942 to 1947, and that by the 75th anniversary, 2022, you will have a new India, I had tried very hard to provide an alternative vision of what that new India might look like. But those are just prefatory remarks. I have 3 excellent panelists with me, and my role today is that of a moderator. And so I will turn first to Sadanand Dhume and ask him for his assessment of the current state of India's democracy. There have been many evaluations, often emanating outside India. Some have called India a flawed democracy. Another has described India as an electoral autocracy. And there's always a little bit of a nationalistic pushback against these evaluations made abroad. And there are, of course, assertions in India that we are a wonderfully functioning electoral democracy. So to begin with, let's get a broad view of what you consider to be the state of democracy in India.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Bose, and it's great to be back at this conference and on this extremely distinguished panel. So, every time I write a column in the Wall Street Journal about the state of Indian democracy, or every time I speak at a conference or appear on a television program to discuss this, I often feel that there's a significant section of either my readership or my audience that is genuinely bewildered by the idea of India's ranking declining on democracy indices. And in fairness, I can understand where they're coming from. Because if you live in India, it kind of feels like there's an election going on all the time. It's like nothing else seems to be part of the news. In the last election in 2019, more than 600 million people voted in India. That was a turnout of 67%. I want to compare that with 3 countries, Ireland, Switzerland, and Canada. All of those 3 countries had a turnout that was less than India's, yet all of those 3 countries are ranked as either liberal democracy in VDEM's ranking, as free in Freedom House's ranking, or as full democracies in the EIU ranking. Whereas India is called an electoral autocracy by VDEM, it is called partly free by Freedom House, and it is called a flawed democracy by EIU. So I understand why the average Indian would sort of look at these things and say that, well, these rankings are severely flawed and they don't capture our reality. In my view, what is really going on, though, is not any kind of conspiracy, but it's a fact that when we talk about democracy and democracy rankings and what the average Indian thinks of as democracy are not the same thing. When we speak about democracy broadly, or what these indices are trying to measure, is a specific form of democracy, which is liberal democracy. And if I had to encapsulate that very, very fast for you, it would be a democracy that includes institutions that are designed to check the excesses of government power. So typically, there would be an independent judiciary, a free media, professional civil service or bureaucracy. So the government might try to do something to rob an individual citizen of liberty, but that these institutions are there to push back. And the decline that you see in India over the past 8 years in particular, the very dramatic decline on all of these indices, is not because India is becoming less of an electoral democracy. In fact, turnout has been rising. It's because these liberal institutions have become weaker. And as these liberal institutions become weaker, it raises a question about whether Indian democracy, the way it is currently configured, is able to protect certain core liberal principles. That is things like equality before the law. That was things like individual rights being more important than group rights. It's the idea that all people carry equal moral worth. It's this idea that we use free speech and the scientific method as a means of assessing the truth. These are kind of broad liberal principles that all liberal democracies share, and the ones that are functioning well have put in place in the institutions I spoke about, a free press, a free media, a professional bureaucracy that guards against those individual rights being eroded. I would argue that what we have in India at the moment, and we can get into a sort of deeper discussion of this as we go along, but I would argue that what we have at the moment is a ruling party, and more specifically a ruling ideology, that is uncomfortable with some of these aspects of liberalism. It is not uncomfortable with elections. They love elections, and they're very good at them. They are uncomfortable with some of these underlying liberal principles, not with all of them, but with some of them. And that is really at the heart of the tension that lies between how the world views India's democracy, which they view it as declining, and how the ruling party itself views it. And rather than frame it the way I have framed it, they obviously find it easier to frame it in terms of some foreign conspiracy to keep the country down or something, whatever, which is what I get attacked by my wonderful, passionate Twitter trolls, some of whom I hope are in this audience. So why don't I leave it at that, and we can sort of have more in the next round.
Thank you very much, Sadanand, for giving your bird's eye view of Indian democracy and also spotlighting the decline in institutional checks and balances in India's democracy over the last decade or so. Let me turn next to you, Anand Shah. Anand, you've actually lived and worked in India from 2002 to 2014 and in the great state of Gujarat during those years. Tell us about Indian democracy from a slightly different angle of vision. Now, democracy is, of course, much more about elections. But if we stay for a moment with electoral democracy, what are voters' expectations when they take part in this process in what is often called the festival of Indian democracy? Do you see that voters' expectations, their aspirations have changed or shifted over the period of time that you've been observing India?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bose, and thank you all for being here for part of the panel that was able to attend. I want to start with a quick story. I go to Delhi fairly often, and there's recently been a project in New Delhi to redo the central vista of Delhi, right? The central vista, the part that's been done, is akin to the Washington Mall or the Boston Esplanade. But it's really important to understand why this is symbolic, in my view, of the thriving democracy of India, even if it's not the one that we all would like. Right? Before the Central Vista was a narrow set of things with a series of ponds that were built during Lutyens' building of Delhi in the 30s and 40s that didn't have any water in them. There were monkeys and there were some people showing things. You could buy some Golgappa, whatever it is. If I was there in December and it was full of 6,000 people sitting there having picnics of all walks of life, dressed up from all over the country, right? The people who were critics of that change were critics of the change because they lost something that was valuable to them of the past. Objectively, it's been renovated. It looks exactly like it did, but better, and the ponds work and there are bathrooms now. And therefore, it's available to everyone. This happened in Gujarat with the Sabarmati Riverfront project. It happened with the Kankaria Lake project. And the reason I bring this up is because I think it reflects two really big trends in the democratic institutional evolution of India today. The first is that people are voting not for preserving the past and not for preserving some sort of short-term gain, meaning give me some alcohol when I have to vote or get me a television so that you can buy my vote. They're voting for what they think the future might look like. Right? This government that's in power now, that people like to criticize, gets this really, really well. Right? For all of those that think it's not liberal, right, they're the only ones that are talking about green energy. They're the only ones talking about building a bathroom in everybody's house. They're the only ones with the minister out there with a broom sweeping. They're the only ones out there talking about financial inclusion. They're the only ones that have released healthcare that's universal for everybody and affordable. All of those topics in America, by the way, would be bleeding heart liberal. Right? So the argument I'm making to you is not that it should be seen through the lens of what liberal means here, liberal means there. It's an institutional mix. The institutions we think of as democratic, right? The press, which has always been yellow in India, minus a small sliver, right? The courts, which are flawed because they're elements of privilege. There's lots of issues, right? The other institutions of democracy, the ones that actually deliver on getting roads built, the ones that get housing for the poor, the ones that make sure if you apply for a water connection you get it, those are working for the first time in 75 years, right? That's what people are voting for. The second argument I'd make is the attack on the liberal institutions that we speak of, from an observer's perspective, is an attack on the institutions of privilege in the way that people in India would see them, right? That's why they talk about things that talk about people of the past who have had access or gatekeepers to power. The institutions that should keep the government in check, the ones that Sadanand spoke of, have sub-institutions of privilege, right? In order to become, we celebrate in India when one student from Bihar in a village gets into IIT. Why is it only one? The other 3,999 came from privilege, right? The break that the government or the politics is trying to make, I think, is going after breaking privilege and supporting the past. Right? The threat to democracy, which has always existed in India, is a lack of opposition. Right? From the beginnings of Indian Constitution, when we became a republic, until the late, mid-90s, minus a period in the middle that the Congress screwed up in, was largely unopposed. Right? The last 30 years, we've seen opposition grow. And now we're in a place where suddenly it looks like there's no opposition. And we're screaming that, wait, there's no freedom for people to come into X or Y or Z. That is a separate issue. That separate issue to me is a reflection of the quality of people who are in the political profession. Right? I used to joke, we spent a lot of time in India getting young people to care about the country, that if you really want to do something in India, you really care about impact, you should be willing to run for office. Ask any wealthy parent in Bombay, Delhi, any city, if my child can go into government, they'd slap him silly and send him to America. That's the reflection. We can't be mad that the people winning the political game are not our kind of people when we're not willing to run. Right? We have to change the culture of the folks. And that's a long game. And we'll fix the problems of democracy, which are flawed everywhere in the world. These issues of privilege, the issues of the past, it's as true in America as it is in India. Right? Democracy isn't perfect, but it's better than anything else out there. Indian democracy is newer, younger, less mature. Right? Perhaps less perfect, but it's a plane that we're flying and trying to fix as it gets heavier and more people get born and they come of age. And by the way, and I'll end with this, all of the people voting today, by and large, were not alive at the time of independence. Right? They care about a new India and a democracy that works for them. Works for them means give me opportunity. An American dream, an Indian dream that looks like the American dream. That's what I want. And if you spend a few minutes in India today, you will feel that if you try to take off the lens of the crap in the headlines. It's happening. Right? Sorry, and I'll end here, but I was in India a couple of months ago and I needed to pay for a dosa on the side of the street, my favorite street food, and I didn't have any cash. Right? I had a 2,000 rupee bill, and the guy was like, I don't have change for 2,000 rupees. I was like, oh, well, how am I going to pay you? He's like, you don't have phone pay? And I was like, no. He showed me how to do it and connected me to UPI. The joke that's running right now is the way to tell the difference between NRI and a domestic Indian is that the Indians use electronic payment. It's the NRIs only that use cash. That is change, and it's fast.
So, friends, you already have two different perspectives on the state of Indian democracy. The central vista with which Anand started his opening remarks, of course, has been quite controversial. I went to take part in this wonderful gathering of people in the third week of January, but it was all closed off because the date was too close to the 26th of January. And so I went to Parliament and stood in the balcony of the old Parliament building and saw the new Parliament building that's coming up too close to the old one for comfort, in my view. And I didn't like the aesthetics of it, but that's a matter of personal taste. But let's get a third view on the state of India's democracy. Mukulika has a wonderful new book that was published recently, Cultivating Democracy. And tell us a little bit how your anthropological study of democracy at the local level, you actually study two villages in great depth in Birbhum in Bengal. How does that illuminate some of the broader trends and challenges in the Republic?
Thank you, Sugata, and thank you to the wonderful organizers of this panel. I just wanted to say a word in solidarity with what you said at the start, Aruna, that this is not as representative a panel as you'd like. But one of the things I can bring to the table into this discussion is as an anthropologist, you don't speak just for yourself. So much of my understanding of Indian democracy is shaped by 20 years of immersion in these villages, right? So it's not just about learning how village life works, it's about learning to think from the village. And it is a productive place to think about Indian democracy because 70% of India still lives in villages, as we heard in the morning panel on caste and inequality. And it is the India that is not the aspirational India that Anand just told us about. It's a different India. And it's a perspective that we hear much less about because they aren't the NRIs. Those are not the opinions that are echoed in a gathering like this. So it'll be that much more unfamiliar, I think, in any setting like this. So that's part of the job of translation, but also thinking from a completely different vantage, as you're encouraging us to do. So let me tell you very briefly what I've learned from this 20-year immersion, from thinking about democracy from an Indian village, not just about it. It's worth remembering that in 1950, when the Constitution of India was adopted, how is India described? India is described as a sovereign, democratic republic. Those are the words. Now, this wasn't without controversy. Many people, including Nehru, thought calling it a democracy was enough. And look at us, we organize panels on democracy because we think we know what we are talking about. But Ambedkar interjected and said, no, I want the words republic and democracy to exist. And why was this? Democracy stood for a cluster of ideas, and the Republic stood for a cluster of ideas. And I think the one-line conclusion is that what is happening with Indian democracy is that our idea of democracy, of politics, is almost entirely around the cluster of ideas that Ambedkar said was under democracy, and it is the Republic, that you've just used this word yourself, that is entirely under threat. So let me just spell out quickly what these ideas are. So Indian democracy, and this is obviously a bit schematic, but it helps our purpose to understand this. This is what we would call the institutional framework, what Sadanand was talking. This is the political democracy of institutions, of separation of powers, of a free media, free judiciary and impartial judiciary, institutions, and so on. It is the form of democracy that determines the relationship between citizens and their leaders, so it's a vertical relationship, so what we achieve through elections. And it is this verticality that also says something about our image of the voter, why they're voting, what motivates them to vote, and so on. In the Republic, on the other hand, and why Ambedkar was so keen on introducing this word, was he said, this comes from a train of thought that's coming from Jyotirao Phule and John Dewey in Columbia, where he was Ambedkar's favorite teacher, where social democracy, democracy in life, in social interactions, was really important. It was about horizontal relationships between citizens. How people interact with each other was just as important. And the word fraternity that is there in the Indian Constitution is about that. It is about creating solidarity with people who you are not related to by religion or caste or gender or whatever else. It is the relationship the bonds you can form with other people. Now, when we taking stock on the state of Indian democracy, I think, as I said, I think the big problem is that Indian democracy's problems are precisely because our achievements of the Republic have been a huge failure. And that's what needs work. And let me give you two examples. One is, if any of you were here, was anyone here at the caste discussion this morning? Okay, great, some of you were. Now, if we wanted to say anything about fraternity, and if you heard the brilliant panelists this morning, then really our failure to create social justice, to create any sense of lack of dehumanizing of non-Savarna Indians is a work in progress, but it's been a huge failure and there's lots to do. So we can say that, we can park that. On the institutional framework, again, one can say a lot, but since both my colleagues here have mentioned elections, and because I've spent most of my time the last 20 years reading and thinking about elections and studying them, elections in India I have celebrated them. I've spoken the world over saying what a remarkable it's the biggest man-made exercise anywhere in the world, right? Human exercise anywhere. And India pulled it off. Of course, there were flaws. There will be flaws in any large exercise, but we pulled it off. It was free and it was fair. And the reason why I wrote a book called Why India Votes was really to understand this trend that Sadanand mentioned. Every election, our turnout goes up. To ask what is it that people wanted, why they were voting. And they were voting for things. But one of our big research findings was also that people liked the act of voting. They liked to go to a polling station. People from the most socially disadvantaged groups in India vote in the highest numbers. Why? Because it's the only day that you land up at the polling station and you find your bhai or your driver in the queue in front of you. It's the only day and the only space where you can't say, go to the back, I'm here. You won't dare ask it, and if you do, they'll say, forget it. It's the only experience of genuine social equality any Indian has if you are from that strata. Now, what is deeply worrying and which we notice much less, yes, there seems to be a constant election on. The whole point of a democracy is that you have elections, and then you have the Republican moment, is the temporality between elections. What happens in between in regular social life is what is going to determine the outcome of the next election. that is fraught by vigilante violence, by polarization, all kinds of things that we are familiar, and we can talk about this more. But let me just end by saying one really significant thing about elections. Elections in India have very fundamentally been corrupted in 3 ways. Electoral bonds have legitimized election funding to be absolutely opaque, so we've gone back rather than improved campaign expenditure. The Election Commission of India, which used to be an impartial body, no longer enjoys that reputation. And the ballot that used to be secret no longer remains a secret. And if you want to know why, I'll tell you later. So and I'll tell you later in the discussion, I don't want my chair to get upset with me. But so when we talk about democratic indicators and where we are on VDEM and Freedom Index, Freedom of House Index, my sense as a student, as a scholar of democracy, of Indian democracies, I compare Indian democracy today with where it was 10 years ago, 50 years ago. That is I'm not interested in what the Americans are going to tell me about it. Indian democracy, God knows we know there have been problems here, right? But we have to compare our performance or Indian elections performance with our own performance in the back and where we could be better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mukulika. Had Swati Maliwal been able to come and join us and speak at this panel, I would have asked her to assess Indian democracy through the prism of women's rights and women's representation in our elected bodies. But in her absence, I just wanted to make a brief comment on that. It wasn't just that the minorities were underrepresented in the Lok Sabha in which I served, but women were also badly underrepresented. And of course, ever since 1996, Women's Reservation Bill has been hanging fire, has not been passed. My mother was a 3-term member of the Lok Sabha after a long life in academia. And once she figured out that that kind of reservation will probably not be enacted, she had in the year 2000 brought an amendment to the Representation of People Act. And basically, it would have compelled all registered and recognized political parties to nominate at least 40% men and 40% women on their candidates' lists in each state during any election to the state assembly or to parliament. And that, I think, would have been the best way to dramatically increase women's representation, because if you look at the world over, it's only where political parties have given high rates of nominations to women that you've achieved some degree of gender balance. But it's so hard in India's democratic system for an individual to bring a bill and get it to be considered and passed. You can introduce a bill, but then you can't push it through. So my mother was unable to get it enacted. So when I was in Parliament in 2016, I actually submitted a very similar bill in 2016. I got it introduced, everybody accepted it, but it was almost impossible to move it forward. It is only government bills, by and large, that can get through in India's democratic system. And I thought that one needs to consider now how to, in fact, have a more just gender balance in our state assemblies and in Parliament. Things have changed at the local level, we know, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And in the absence of the chairperson of the Delhi Commission for Women, I at least wanted to bring up that aspect. Now, I would like now to turn, and I hope that all of you will be brief in your responses, because I do want to take questions from the audience. It's a patient audience, a large audience in physical presence here, but also a virtual audience. Let me just say that I wonder, Anand, whether there is actually a genuine break from the past. And I say this because, I'm not a great champion of liberalism in the sense that, liberalism has always been tainted by the liberalism of empire in India. That's why we've always had an ambivalent relationship with liberalism as an ideology. But my worry is that, in fact, there are far too many continuities with our colonial past. Let me give just one example. When the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act was amended by the current Parliament soon after the elections of 2019, it struck me as if on the 100th anniversary of the Rowlatt Act, it was that kind of a lawless law back with a vengeance. You know, Gandhi had regarded it as a black act passed by a satanic government. It was providing for preventive detention, the ability for the government to brand any individual a terrorist in a way that our colonial masters used to do. Another example would be the law of sedition, which is still on the books, a colonial law of sedition which the United Kingdom has got rid of. But our Supreme Court, after dilly-dallying for a very long time, started hearing challenges to that law in May 2022, but it's still on our statute books. So with all this talk about breaks with the past, aren't there too many states of exception from the rule of law that post-colonial India, including the current regime, still holds on to, either continues colonial statutes or reenacts them? And I think that's something that we really need to consider. And the other question, which I'd like all of you to address, is whether, in fact, what we see in India's democracy today is a challenge to privilege. And in this context, I feel I must ask that if a government, if a regime is so close to the fat cats of Indian capitalism, and let me name names with Gautam Adani, then can we realistically say that Indian democracy has taken a stand against privilege? Or is it the wealthiest, the 1%, as they call this class here, that seems to have a truly privileged relationship with our current regime and our ruling class? And so, even though the questions are sort of raised in response to Anand, with whom I probably disagree the most, I'd like Sadanand to start and then talk a little bit about the future as you see it. So what trends can we expect in the future?
Let me go very fast and let me sort of sharpen some of my disagreement with Anand, but also agree with him on some stuff. I think that sort of I'm all for drinking water and toilets and homes, and I'm not a fan of the aesthetics of the Central Vista project, but I'm all for 6,000 people gathering, and I'm all for digital payments on phones. But with all due respect, that's not democracy. It's perfectly easy to imagine a completely dictatorial regime that has the trains run on time and has people getting water. I mean, when we talk about democracy, for the discussion to have meaning and substance, it has to be about rights. And the rights in question, I think, have clearly come under siege. I'll just give a few examples. We have many states that have passed so-called love jihad laws, which effectively try to outlaw a person from one faith, in this case, a male from Islam marrying a woman from another faith. That is illiberal by any stretch of the imagination. We have these freedom of religion laws, which seek to basically bar conversion. Now, you may think that conversion is a really bad thing, and that's a legitimate opinion. You may also think that interfaith marriage is a bad thing, which is, again, people are entitled to an opinion. But when you start passing laws, and those laws are very clearly designed to affect one group of your citizens differently from another group of citizens, then you're basically flouting a basic liberal principle, which is that we don't always succeed, but we try to treat all people the same. And that's the heart of it, right? The heart of it is things like, as Professor Bose said, the UAPA being amended so that it's not just belonging to it's not just belonging to a terrorist group that it can get you into trouble, but you can just be individually. I could just, pick on the guy in the green jacket over there and say that, hey, I think you individually are a terrorist. These things have really serious implications, and that's what the debate is in the end, right? Because that's what defines, that is the difference between living in a democracy and living in an autocracy. Running water is not the difference between living in a democracy and living in an autocracy.
Says someone who has
So-
running water.
No, says anyone. It's just the way it is. Nazi Germany had running water. It wasn't a democracy.
Yeah, but so just to respond for
But
a
let me
second.
just finish my point, and then I'll. On your second point, I agree, and I disagree with Professor Bose. I think there is definitely, I think he's right, I think Anand is right, that there is an element of overthrowing the old elite. And I don't think it means people like Ambani and Adani. I think it specifically means old social and intellectual elites. There is definitely a very strong element of that. There's a very strong element of anti-elitism, and this is not unique to the BJP. This is true of all populists. This is true of Orban in Hungary. This is true of Erdogan in Turkey. They are able to tap in to a very real kind of class resentment, and they are able to portray the people who are opposed to them as kind of like these caricatured creatures of privilege, right? So in the Indian case, they'd use terms like Khan Market Gang and Lutyens Gang. Though I have to say that the people who use these are the people who sort of seem to be, I seem to see a lot of them in Khan Market for some reason. But we'll, we'll leave that aside for a moment. And I think sort of pivoting to the future, I think the real question that we face in terms of the shape of Indian democracy is that are India's institutions going to be able to push back against things that very clearly distinguish between different groups of citizens based on religion or other characteristics? That's the test in the end. The test is not. And I think all these things are great, but I don't think you can say that, well, I've passed a law that makes it easier to toss someone into jail for years without bail, and because there are more taps in villages, therefore that doesn't matter. You still have to have both conversations.
Okay, let Anand have his
He took all my
response.
he took all my time.
Yes.
No, look, I can't disagree with that, right? The point I'm trying to make is that it's not zero-sum one or the other, right? There's no point in having a law that says X when the vast majority of people don't have basic access also to rights of clean water, clean air, transportation, housing. These are rights too. And they're also democratic rights and human rights that matter, right? Does that make it less democratic? I fully agree, right? Love jihad should not be happening, right? The acts that are being modified, people not being able to get bail for jail, like people not being guilty before being innocent, all these things should not be happening. I agree. They're concurrent. The issue is that what are voters responding to, right? And in the case of the government of India, the people who are voting, or in India, people who are voting are saying, look, I hear all that stuff you guys are saying about, these acts that affect a whole bunch of elite people, but get me a road, get me water, get my kid to school, and I'll give you my vote, right? And they're realizing that that's important. And would it be better if we had people running for office who looked at democracy as all of these things to get a vote? Absolutely. I wish that was the case. I wish I could get elected, but no one votes for me. So, but that's on the second piece of the past. I could probably talk forever about anachronisms of why India is constantly in colonial mindset. Until 2006, the Tamil Nadu government still sent cigars to Winston Churchill on his birthday because it was in the books, right? And the challenge is that, do we have the capability, the people making the laws have the capability to see the bias that they have of the past? I don't know, because they've learned from only what they've seen in the past. And again, to me, that's a capacity problem, right? If we could take a really clear stab, I mean, or we could even argue that the Constitution 70 years ago and how it operated also may be flawed because of its proximity to that past then. Can we have a legitimate democratic conversation about what an outside-in first principles view of the democracy India needs to protect everybody equally needs to look like? I don't think we're having that conversation, and I wish we were.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay.
Let's try to have that conversation in the remaining 10 minutes, but quickly, let's have Mukulika respond, then I'll go to the audience questions.
I'll make 2 or 3 quick points, which are exactly to what has been said. It might not seem so, but I think probably one way of getting away from whether this is liberal or not is my yardstick is always, is it constitutional or not? Right? And if it's not constitutional, it's not acceptable. So if you don't have equal rights to X and Y, it's in the Constitution enshrines certain rights. Whether or not it fits in the liberal framework is neither here nor there. I don't think that the triumph of the Indian Constitution, Anand, was that it precisely had a brand new imagination for a brand new country. It wasn't one that merely was a handover of a colonial hangover, and that is precisely why it is an interesting document. On rights, it is interesting, we've all noticed this, that you no longer have adhikar, you're a labharti, you're somebody who is a welfare recipient. You've now become a recipient of state welfare with the Prime Minister's face on every sack of rice you get. So you are a recipient, not a rights-bearing citizen. And if we are going to talk about lifting everybody, then why is it that in last week's budget, the final budget before the election, really next year, why is it that the largest employment program, Manrega's allocation, has gone down? Why is it that our spending on health and education is lower than it ever has been? How is this going to benefit the millions of Indian citizens who are not the aspiring India that you're talking about?
Totally.
Okay, thank you. Now, the first question is, in fact, from the app that's come through. Talking of a future India, which paradigm is more appropriate as regards Article 21 of the Indian Constitution? Is it the procedures established by law or the due process of law? Just for those of you who may not know what Article 21 is, it is really the guarantee of fundamental rights, including the right to life and liberty. And here, strangely enough, I have to agree with Anand rather than with Mukulika, that we really need to look very carefully at the founding moment again. Just, celebrating what was established around 1950 will not, get us very far, because there were inheritances of authoritarian trends from the past. And that's why, my grandfather, Sharat Chandra Bose, who was in the freedom struggle, wrote an article on the Constitution dealing with Article 21. And he pointed out that, in fact, it only establishes procedural process as written in 1949. It does not guarantee due process by law. Now, that's why I think it's important to have precisely the kind of conversation that Anand was, talking about. We need to make the Constitution more democratic, more federal, and there were many, dissidents within the Constituent Assembly who had great ideas, whose amendments were all negatived because of the circumstances in which the Constitution was framed at that time. And it's precisely because it was only procedural process that during the emergency, it was possible to suspend fundamental rights, including the right to life and liberty, and even habeas corpus petitions could not be heard. And there was a 4-1 Supreme Court decision at that time with one Justice H.R. Khanna dissenting. And that's why I think it's important to talk about how we can, Parliament is a living organism, there's a constitutional legacy, and how can one make the Indian democracy more democratic, if you will. And the way to do it is to make fundamental rights and habeas corpus in particular as inviolable as possible. You know, the Bill of Rights in the United States is more inviolable than our fundamental rights at this point. So that's the kind of response I would give to the question that was posed virtually. But let me go to at least a couple of questions. We started a little
Late.
We started a little late, so I hope we can go on for a bit. There are microphones on either side.
There's a queue there, Sugata.
Oh, there's already a queue. Oh dear. Okay, so please keep the questions as short as possible. Okay, we'll take 2 or 3 and see how things go.
Thank you so much.
And do allow a little bit of gender balance. I see that there are 3 men ahead of the women, so can we rotate? So you go ahead, and then let...
Thank you so much,
yes.
everyone. My name is Prateek. I'm from Babson College. I'm doing my MBA. My question is to Anand. Like, congratulations on pioneering one of India's first few electric automotive companies. And my question revolves around the factory that you built. Like, again, congrats on building systems within a factory that lead to it.
Get to your question quickly. Yeah.
But
I don't think there's a question
the fact
on
is that
democracy.
they built a factory which is run by only women. So I want to congratulate you on that. But at the same time, does it put you in a position of responsibility to give them, to motivate them with the right amount of knowledge capital about democracy in general, more awareness about how democracy should work? So do you think, along with other forms of capital you provide them, do you think you can also provide them knowledge and awareness and lead them in the right direction in terms of thinking and expecting, you know, like to set that expectation straight from the government?
So,
Okay,
look, I'll be very quick.
Can we collect the
skip it?
questions?
Yeah, good.
In the interest of time, let's collect
Go
the
for it.
questions and then we'll
Please.
give you the responses. Yes, the next one.
Hi, my name is Shruti, and this is going to be for all 4 of you. This is somewhat of the present and the future of democracy. I'm going to start with saying, I want to understand, what do you think, let me rephrase the scenario. Imagine I want to take a pluck card as a single person, put it outside the board in front of, let's say, the White House, and it reads, I don't want uneducated biogards using taxpayer money to build stuff. I want infrastructure and roads and education and social equality. I know what the Constitution of the United States protects me when I take that board and stand in front of the White House. I want to understand what you think will happen, all 4 of you, will happen in present-day India if we take a board like that, a little more colorful. Maybe we can simplify it. I don't care which government it is. I've seen 2 sets of governments, and they're no different, honestly. My parents have paid taxes for 50 years. They sent us here because they said, not worth it for you to stay here and pay taxes. So, yeah, I don't care which government it is. Let's say we take a colorful board and I stand in front of the parliament or whatever in India. What will be the present protection that I will be given? And imagine each level, okay, this is your first protection. If it fails, this is your second protection if this fails.
Yeah.
And what do you want to see in the
question.
future?
Yeah, thank you very much. We just want to give, I think we can at best take 2 more questions, and keep them brief, please, and we'll try to respond as best as we can.
Thanks for the panel. And my name is Jagdish Chinna, and I came from a village from Andhra Pradesh. And so, as we are talking about the democracy, what I truly, and I think I appreciate everybody talking about going to the roots from the village, right? I think that's where key and important. I'm not sure how many are from village here. How many are from the village? Yeah, it's very handful, but the point is that my dad is like, around 65 years old, and the way how it is happening in the government there, and they put a attempt to murder case, and he's in a farmhouse, and he's doing his retirement in this farmhouse, and they forcefully vacated him, and this is just a year back, by the cops. And unfortunately, he died again. The last year he died, actually. So because all this stress and all. So basically, right, I think, the freedom, the democracy, and the rights, right? And he is like, 65, 75 years old person. And they put a non-bailable or attempt to murder case. They just want to make a point that how the government is operating, and how this mafia and what these cops are playing in the whole gamut of things in the villages, actually.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll take one last question. And I'm truly sorry, but we have to be fair to the panels that will come after us. Okay.
Hello, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to ask. My name is Reena, and I come from Vancouver. I'm a teacher, and there have been teachers in my family. This is the third generation. Mr. Shah, you had said that if you were to ask any of these rich people's kids, would they be willing to run in a political setup? And you said, well, most of them would not. So which I do understand. So is that because we have seen the history, we've seen in the near past that the two major political parties would not let them survive. So why would the rich kids actually want to run for a government position when they can sit and actually run the government on their own terms? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's have very quick last words, addressing the questions as best as you can.
Why don't we go in the other direction?
Okay, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, I was waiting for my turn. About the village, I'm really sorry what happened to your father. I don't know where. There you are. And I think it is awful. It is, there's a lot to be fixed. But I think there is an issue, a flaw in the Constitution about federalism, which is the problem in the way we govern our villages, that political power is not devolved, and even less devolution occurs in fiscal power. So actually what happens at the village level in terms of administrative and political clout is so little, and this is the big flaw, I think, in the Constitution, where the location of power was very centralized. So the element of misgovernance and therefore a lack of accountability, which is at the heart of democratic practice, which your father and you should have had, simply did not take place, and that is a symptom of what is wrong. Very briefly, I just wanted to say before I left the stage, this is my last chance, I don't know about any of you, but I grew up in Delhi in the 70s and 80s, and anyone could go and eat ice cream and sit on those green lawns. Just
I've been
to
there
put
myself
yeah.
many times.
Okay.
Anand.
I knew that was going to be controversial. Look, I think this comes down to the idea of due process, period, right? I mean, you can protest in India right now, right? The question is, when you get accused of something on the books, can you still protest after that? Or are you stuck fighting the weaponization of laws in our flawed system or not? And I think that that's a big challenge to the democratic establishment of India as a whole. So in my view, all of these things, the story about your father, the ability to protest, that matters. On the politician issue, look, people choose to do with their time what they think is best, right? And they don't feel that the best return for them, the more that you have access to possibilities, you don't think the best return for you is politics, right? And that's unfortunate, right? In the idea of public service, the concept of being able to give to society should be something extremely highly valued. And it's just a reflection of the culture of how politics has evolved in India that we weren't allowed in. You may not be allowed in now. The BJP theoretically was a democratic party, on its original foundings. There have been other parties. I think that Aam Aadmi, unfortunately she's not here, but Aam Aadmi has been very much democratic in your ability to enter. But it is what it is.
So, I think all the questions, or most of the questions, sort of seem to center on the idea of repression and so on. I'm going to end on a little bit of an optimistic note, where I have even though I'm a big critic of where things are headed with the government, but I think on the question of repression and dissent, there is one way in which I think the world misunderstands India, which is that actually there is a reasonable amount of room to dissent and protest. But the key there really is because India is so large and is a federation. So for example, I can sit in Calcutta all day and abuse Narendra Modi, no problem. But there's a certain politician I wouldn't want to criticize if I'm sitting in Calcutta. Similarly, I could sit in Tamil Nadu and criticize the government in Delhi all day. This is not to say that the central government loves criticism or is very open to it. It's just that India is a collection of thin-skinned despots. And so you can sort of figure out a way to triangulate and make room for yourself to dissent under that umbrella. Thank you.
Yes, I'm glad that you brought up federalism towards the very end, because no discussion of democracy in India can be truly meaningful without looking at the question of federalism. And I do hope that a healthier dose of federalism in India of the future will in fact strengthen Indian democracy. And whatever Sadanand might say, I think there are resources in the south and the east to achieve that particular goal. And I'd also like the young people here to say that don't be worried when people talk about, where are the 24/7 politicians? The one thing that's worse than 24/7 news channels in India these days, which are unwatchable, are 24/7 politicians, because they tend to be overambitious, they tend to be narcissistic, and so on. Try to find some time away from your careers to engage in public service. And I can promise you, I found those 5 years that I served in Parliament rewarding, even as I felt I was battling against a drift from democracy towards majoritarianism. And I just hope that if there are more young people who join the political process in India, then we will be able to save India from the scourge of majoritarian tyranny. Thank you very much, all of you.